Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this wonderful world of ours. I hope you're safe, sound, and above all, healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm really honored to welcome to the program Nick Kristof. And Nick, I know you're out on the West Coast. Thanks for getting up a little early. I know you're a farm boy, so this isn't going to be a problem for you.
Delighted to join you.
Yeah, I have to say, Nick, it's really two Pulitzers and decades at the Times, both as a foreign reporter, a foreign correspondent, as a columnist, really extraordinary. But what impresses me even more than that is the fact that you really have had an impact. One of your columns, I think that you wrote in 1997, is framed in the lobby of the Gates Foundation, and it was apparently your reporting on global health and the way illness affected children in India and elsewhere that prompted the Gates Foundations to begin to spend billions. And if that weren't enough for impact, I think it was the head of the International Red Cross somewhere in the early aughts said that your coverage of the genocide in Darfur really had led to saving literally hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's really great to have you on the program.
I'm really happy to be with you.
Before we delve into the state and fate of America at home and abroad, a big subject for 45 minutes, I want to drill down a bit on the Nick Kristof backstory. I try to start these interviews by a brief exploration of who made Nick Kristof. When I interviewed Ken Burns, I think I've mentioned before, he lost his mom at an early age, and he posed the question to us as to whether or not his reaching back in the past, who is he actually trying to connect with? Interviewing Bill Burns, I asked Bill about his dedication to public service. He said he came from a military background. That seemed clear. But I'm curious to know, what shaped your early interests, not just in the world at large, but in journalism. I have a few questions on this, but I'll let you open up.
So sure. So there were, I think, two fundamental forces that framed me. And one was the fact that my dad was a refugee from Eastern Europe. The family was Armenian. They spied on the Nazis. They got caught in 1943. Some were executed by the Nazis, others executed by the Soviet communists. They fled in every which direction. My dad was in concentration camp, asbestos mine. And then a French diplomat spoke up and saved his life. And, it wasn't really this diplomat's job, but he did so. And I exist as a result. In 1952, some Americans here in Portland, in Oregon, sponsored his way to the U.S. And, again, that's why we're speaking here. And so that, my dad's story was sort of fundamental. And the other thing is growing up here in rural Oregon, in a farming community that was a very, working class, low education area. And then the jobs went away in the 1990s and meth arrived, and it's been devastating here. And I've lost a lot of friends, and that is, very much shaped. And I mean, it's been incredibly frustrating to see, and has certainly shaped my values and, how I think we should address them.
Yeah, I mean, you did run for governor, and I'm going to get back to that issue later on. But I just want to read to you something out of Chasing Hope, a reporter's journey, reporter's story.
Reporter's life.
A reporter's life. Quote, my dream since I was a kid was to be a journalist, flying into civil wars, covering humanitarian catastrophes, mobilizing a response. It had seemed so glamorous. In high school in rural Oregon, I had read about foreign correspondents with awe and seen journalists on television shows like Washington Week in Review. I read globetrotting correspondence in the Times and in the university. You say I invited dates to watch movies about foreign correspondents like The Killing Fields and The Year of Living Dangerously. And then you, in parentheses, you mark my dates were always very impressed by my movie choices. So you were raised, your parents were both academics. So books, small town, the need to broaden your horizon. Um, how much did that play a role?
S well, because of my dad's background, I was always kind of very exposed to the world, even though, you know, I was in the middle of nowhere, and, uh, my dad was also, it was always a little ambiguous kind of what his identity was. He was ethnically Armenian, but couldn't speak Armenian. His brother would call him up and they would speak Polish together. My aunt would call up and they would speak Romanian together. They were a little fuzzy about what they were. Um, but it certainly did, make me aware of the world. And then because I was in a small community, in a small school, I was able to embrace writing and journalism really beginning, in about the eighth grade. And as soon as I got a driver's license at age 16, I was able to get a job at the local paper. Um, and it just, I fell in love with it. Both the craft of writing, I mean, the kind of the aesthetic pleasure of crafting a beautiful sentence, and also the sense of impact that one could highlight issues and, begin to make a difference.
Yeah. I mean, since the fifth grade, I wanted to be a history professor, history teacher. It never worked out exactly. But I think that's part of the issue of how your thinking and your career aspirations sort of evolved. Again, let me quote something that you wrote. You write, journalism is an act of hope. What impels reporters forward is our faith that if we get the story and shine a light in the darkness, the public will respond and change will come. That's why reporters rush toward gunfire, talk their way into drug dens, scramble toward riots, and in my case right now, take a small plane into the heart of the Congo civil war. You really do believe that writing journalism and telling other people's stories has a capacity to change the world.
And I mean, it does. I've seen that imperfectly, not always the way would like, but the article that you mentioned that led the Bill and Melinda Gates to invest in global health, that article kind of fell flat. There wasn't a vast reaction to it, but these two readers in Seattle were trying to figure out how to direct their philanthropy,
Yeah,
and as a result, it was the most important piece I ever wrote. I found it very frustrating to write about AIDS in the early 2000s, and I think I had negligible impact there. But Darfur, I think my writing really did have an impact. On the Rohingya, it didn't. But sometimes it happens often enough that it really does feel like it. That it advances my sense of purpose and meaning that I can find in this profession.
yeah. So on the craft, a couple questions. How do you keep, or can you keep? I mean, you've had two careers as a journalist. One is a foreign correspondent, which I assume means just the facts, ma'am, and then as a commentator. During very perilous times, we live in an argue culture. But I want to ask you, how do you keep, as a foreign correspondent, as a reporter, is it possible to keep your own views, your own values out of the story? How do you prevent, you're trying to tell other people's stories, but how do you prevent your own story from insinuating itself into, or maybe it's not a problem. I'm just curious. How do you parse all that out?
So I think that, like most reporters, I started with a view that we have to be very careful not to impose our values, our views. And, to a great extent, that's true. You can't cover a city council meeting feeling like you're saving the world. But to some degree, perhaps, Aaron, I was ruined a little bit by covering the Tiananmen democracy movement and the massacre that followed in 1989. And when you see a modern government use weapons of war against protesting students, you're not neutral about it.
Right.
And you have to cover each side. You have to be independent of the students. But, if you look at my writing then, uh, I clearly thought that massacring peaceful protesters was wrong. And the kind of stories that I wrote at the time, they quoted the government saying that it was putting down a counter-revolutionary rebellion. But, it was clear from my writing that I was pushing back at that idea. And, in, in general, I think witnessing that pushed me more toward covering human rights, more toward um, issues of ordinary people. I think also maybe, coming from a farm town in the middle of nowhere also made me more perhaps attuned to people in different countries out in the middle of nowhere and the consequences of policies on them. And so after Tiananmen also, there was a young Chinese man who had helped us, my wife and me, cover the Tiananmen democracy movement and the massacre. He got in trouble. He ended up in prison. He escaped from prison and asked Cheryl and me for help fleeing the country. You know, pretty clear that as a reporter, you're neutral. You should not be helping an escaped felon flee the country. We did help him, and that, to me, I think, in retrospect, was a bit of a break from this purely neutral model of what foreign correspondents should do.
Yeah. I mean, it leads me into another question with respect to risk and the assessment of risk. I interviewed Clarissa Ward a while back, and we had this discussion of fraught moments when she wondered whether or not it was right to put herself in harm's way, given her family. I wonder how foreign correspondents assess risk, particularly in a place like Iraq and Ukraine. You don't just, it's not the 19th, early 20th century. You've got support systems, you've got all kinds of technology to help ameliorate risk, and you've got people on the ground on whom you rely. But how do you assess risk? And have you ever been in situations, Nick, where you wondered whether or not you might not make it?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there's been a real and positive change in journalism. It used to be 20 years ago that correspondents just kind of marched into dangerous situations. And too often, I think we were oblivious to that risk, or we got together at a hotel bar and said, well, if we go down that road, then, we can get this great story. And, I remember in Afghanistan during the war back in 2001, trying to tell some colleagues not to try to sneak into Kandahar when it was still held by the Taliban, dressed up in burqas.
Right.
And now, the Times and I think other newspapers have been a lot more careful. In, I guess, around 2012, I sneaked into Syria from Turkey, and the Times made me take a security consultant along who very much limited where I could go. And I was, sort of cursing him under my breath. And then shortly after that, the kidnappings began. And I was so grateful. I wanted to give him a big hug. But there, there's a really difficult trade-off. And in writing Chasing Hope, I thought a lot about the fear that I'd imposed on my wife and my kids when I was covering dangerous situations. And I think that we should be more careful, more prudent. But it's also really important to get the story, and how you weigh those is, I think, really hard. People tend to think that that the correspondents are the crazy ones. I've got to say, as a writer, the crazy ones are the photographers and the video people, because they have to be there where the guns are firing. And in terms of putting myself at risk, the book opens with me in a plane crash in Congo, and then on that same trip, I ended up being chased by a warlord through the East Congo jungle for 5 days, and then in the course of that, got the most lethal kind of malaria. So, and that was one trip. So there have certainly been plenty of times when things have gone badly, and I wasn't quite sure I was going to make it. But photographers are so much more so much more out there than we as writers are.
Yeah. So there's less risk in your current um, sort of career as a columnist. And I wonder, do you feel the same sense of purpose um, and drive as a columnist? You're not out in the field, although you do travel. I mean, I don't know how many times you've been to Africa. How
Yeah,
many?
3 trips
Three
this year. Trying
in
to cover the
20
U.S. aid.
in 2025.
Yeah.
We'll get back to that. But um, what do you I mean, what's more impactful, would you say? And how do you deal with you are now espousing your own personal views on matters. How do you feel about all of that?
So, and I find it, a great freedom as long as, but I do think that column writing is best rooted in actual reporting and in getting out and traveling and kicking the tires and getting out of the capital and talking to people who don't speak English and all of that. Um, when I was in China, I was sort of frustrated by people who were sitting in Washington and New York, in a bubble and pronouncing on withered China. And I thought they often missed a lot. And in the run up to the Iraq War, I traveled through Iraq, and it again seemed to me that what you learned on the ground was a lot more complicated and uh, offered a much better warning of what would follow than, being in a bubble in New York or Washington and just pontificating about the future. So I really believe in getting out there, and but that kind of journalism, Aaron, as you know, is fading a little bit, partly because the business model for a lot of journalism is collapsing, and this kind of reporting is expensive. It does involve risk. And, especially if you're the executive producer of a TV news program, you can put a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and have them yell at each other, and you're going to get better ratings than if you send
That's
a reporter
right.
off to, you know, Tigray, Ethiopia to cover a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Right. But again, as a critic now, um, you're freed from the sort of more rigorous standard of objectivity in terms of reporting, even though your criticism and your commentary may be based on reporting. What is How do you sort of differentiate responsible from irresponsible criticism? What makes somebody's opinion a situation of a particular situation not responsible?
Well, I think that one of the challenges in opinion journalism is that it becomes very easy. I mean, we all have cognitive biases, and a lot of that is selection bias that, and we tend to pick up narratives um, that conform to our pre-existing ideology.
Right,
And we also, I think, find it encouraging when we preach to the choir and the choir applauds and tell us how brilliant we are. And so I tend to look for people who are willing to tell the choir that they're all wrong, based on what they've actually found reporting,
right,
and who, are kind of independent from the mob and are also, I guess I'd say that the most important thing that we in journalism do and the greatest impact we have is not about issues that are already on the agenda, where we're kind of stirring the pot of things that people are already talking about, where people already have ideas, but rather it's when we use our spotlight and shine our light on issues that are not on the agenda, but by virtue of that reporting, help project it on the agenda and make people spill their coffee in the morning. And that's,
right,
I think, what brings about change.
right. So it's criticism, identification of issues still as reporting. The material is new in a way, uh,
Yes, I
and
think that's
very
critical.
relevant. Are you your own worst critic? Would you say?
Well, actually, based on Twitter, I have to say there some critics who were even worse, but
Yeah.
even tougher on me. But but I mean, one of the things you pick up in journalism, which is really important, is a measure of humility because you keep getting things wrong.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, the balance I always have is, looking at my work. I know that I've been wrong repeatedly and that my world of liberals have been wrong repeatedly. In the 20th century, liberals were often wrong about one of the fundamental questions about totalitarianism, and there were too many liberals who were soft on communism. Meanwhile, there were too many conservatives who were fundamentally wrong about civil rights, women's rights. The great international issue and the great domestic issue. And so, I think we have, on the one hand, to have this humility and acknowledge the risk that even the things we care most about and are most passionate about, we may end up being wrong on. And yet, you also have to be willing to have a moral compass and speak out about the issues as you call them. But if
Yeah.
that willingness to call them out is tethered to some humility, you're a little bit less likely to wag your finger and to shout people down, which is never very effective at changing minds anyway.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's ingrained in it's either ingrained in humans, Nick, or it is not. And I can identify more than one journalist I met over the years who lacks that humility, and I think it shows. And I think people tend to hit the delete button when it does. In your case, I think it's one of your best qualities. I want to talk a little bit about the state and fate of the American Republic, and I want to begin in a way. You wrote a column in October of this year based on the Trump administration's slashing, eradicating, hollowing out USAID. And you described it, and I know you're not responsible for titles, but I think the column was entitled His Most Lethal Policy. I don't want to drill down on that now. We're going to come back to it. But when you said it was his most, or whoever said it was his most lethal policy,
That was actually my headline. Yeah.
it was. You meant a policy that the president and the administration was pursuing abroad. You've spent most of your life, as have I, focused on foreign policy, international relations, environments, and issues beyond America's shores. And yet, it seems to me that the main struggle, the main challenge for the Republic right now does not lie abroad. With all of the fraught challenges, North Korean nukes, and by the way, if you haven't seen House of Dynamite, Catherine Bigelow's, it's terrifying.
Right.
But people need to see it. Iran's nukes, Ukraine, Xi's policies, Taiwan, all of that concerning, troubling. The real challenge is here at home. You spent much of your career covering authoritarian regimes. The Times had a piece just yesterday entitled, "Are We Losing Our Democracy?" Here it is. I printed it out. It has 12 sorts of metrics by which to begin to judge whether or not this administration has accelerated that process of democratic backsliding. So when you look at the struggle here, based on your own reporting, authoritarian regimes abroad, how worried are you?
I'm deeply worried. I see the Trump administration following the pattern of lots of other authoritarians that I've covered around the world. I think that on the left, people overdo, reach for Nazi examples too much. And it's not, I don't think this is the 1930s. But I do think that there are real parallels with whether it's, Hungary, Venezuela, Poland under the Law and Justice Party, the Philippines, South Korea, China, that the patterns are very similar. And what you see in these countries is a leader who tries to concentrate all the government power, so is taking power from the legislative, from the courts, who is going after the independent arbiters like the media, like lawyers, like universities, and then tends also to, in some cases, license private actors, mobs to intimidate people. We've seen less of the third, but we have seen, I think the amnesty for people involved in the, you know, in the attempted coup is, worrying, and it creates impunity. And um, so, and the kind of the threats and the bullying. So I think they were, very much following that model. On the other hand, I've covered, as you say, I covered a lot of authoritarians around the world, but I've also covered a lot of authoritarian regimes collapsing. And they collapse partly because they tend to make bad decisions because they're surrounded by yes men. So their economic performance tends to be second rate. They tend to be corrupt because, again, nobody's going to tell the president or prime minister you shouldn't, put your money in that cookie jar. That tends to turn people off. And so I'm hopeful. I've written the obituaries for a lot of political obituaries for a lot of autocrats, and I hope I'll have one more to write.
Right. We're going to get back to the issue of what gives you hope, but I want to stay with this for a minute. The travails of the American Republic, though, are in many ways idiosyncratic, given the nature of our Constitution and the way the country and society has evolved. How do you deal? I mean, I have no answer for this. How do you deal with a situation in which the founders basically believe that effective self-governance depended on leaders that had two things? Number one, they had moral self-governance, which is the capacity to control their own demons, their own urges, their own greed, their ambitions. And number two, that they were committed to something broader than their own narrow pursuits. They were committed to public virtue. So one was critically important, moral self-governance, to the other, which was to turn the M in me upside down so it became a W in we. Now, again, I have great faith and hope in the Republic. I mean, we've been through very bad times, although we've never quite been here before. But I just wonder, does the absence of what Peter Baker, one of your colleagues at times, described as the death and dearth of outrage, concern you? I mean, I sit at the local bread and chocolate here on Connecticut Avenue, on the weekends, having coffee with friends, surrounded by people who appear to be happy, and I suspect they have a few extra dollars of disposable income. It may well be most of the policies of this administration are not affecting the way people live their lives. I mean, it's affecting millions of Americans. But I just wonder, the courts, the Congress, the markets, civil society, have they, in your view, are they doing what they can do, or is there more that should be done?
I mean, I would push back a little bit at the idea that we've never been here before. I mean, the U.S. has, as been through some pretty horrendous times. Uh, Regularly, the courts have periodically not stepped up when they should have. But are we being challenged today? Absolutely. And I think your point about American democracy running not necessarily so much on legal guardrails as on norms is absolutely right. And when you get a president who is willing to completely discard those norms, and especially when you have courts that may be willing to indulge him, then you've got a real problem. But I do think that voters still adhere to those norms more,
Yes.
or a majority of voters do. Not clearly, some don't. And I think that does create a guardrail for the country. I, I mean, I think one of the frustrations for me is that the Democratic Party has moved away from working class Americans in ways that a lot of voters are very frustrated with Trump, but they also see the Democratic Party as toxic, and that limits the ability for the Democrats to step up and win in the midterms and the next time around.
Yeah. I mean, I believe deeply in this whole concept of the obligations and responsibilities of citizenship. I mean, I partly because my whole career was dedicated to public service. But America is not some big ATM machine where you only get to make withdrawals, right? You got to make deposits. Now, you made a deposit, a big deposit, and decided to run for governor of Oregon. So let me ask you first, why did you do that?
So it was fundamentally this real frustration with where the state was. And I mentioned earlier that, my hometown had struggled. Well, um, at that point, more than a quarter of the kids on my old school bus were dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide.
Yeah.
And, and I'd had friends who not only suffered greatly, but also inflicted great suffering on others. And I I was upset by the way, to some degree, not just Oregon, but in general, the West Coast Democrats, I thought had um, mismanaged a lot of uh, kind of issues like homelessness, to some degree, like crime, that we were so focused on inputs, we weren't really looking at outcomes. And so, uh, and I thought there was a weak field. I thought that voters were so eager for uh, change that the reformist governor would really have a mandate to try new things. And so I leaped into the fray, and but it was not to be. So I think people should be wary of taking political advice from somebody who, in the end, got pushed out of the race and didn't get a single vote.
Well, let me just, I looked at a couple of pieces here in terms of what happened. Was the Oregon State Supreme Court basically said that while you had extensive ties to the state, including a farm that operates outside of Portland, that election officials were within their right to determine that you did not meet the state's 3-year residency requirement. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what happened basically?
So basically, the Secretary of State of Oregon uh, said that I did not meet the residency requirement, and I thought that was a completely political decision. She was under a lot of pressure um, from people within the political system to push me out because we'd raised more money, we were leading in the polls, and so I thought her decision was poorly founded. But I think but then the state Supreme Court basically said that they would defer to her, that the Secretary of State had the authority to make that decision, and I don't begrudge the justices for that view. I do begrudge the Secretary of State for her decision, and then she was forced to resign in a corruption scandal some months later.
Yeah. Was there one, before we move to foreign policy, was there one takeaway from your experience in American electoral politics?
I mean, this isn't a particularly novel view, but just how important money was, and how much, as a result, the people who one surrounds oneself with are people who are older than the average and wealthier than the average, and are expressing concerns that are not those of average citizens, in ways that I think very much skew outcomes.
Yeah. Let's move to foreign policy. And obviously, we can only skim the surface from these issues. But I want to ask you about two in particular. One is Russia and Ukraine. And I want to get you to react to something. My notion of, given the fact that America can't do and have everything, I think it was FDR, one great president, quipping about Lincoln, our undeniably greatest president, that Lincoln died a sad man because he couldn't have everything. So the United States cannot have everything abroad. One of my former bosses, Madeleine Albright, borrowed, I think, something for Bill Clinton and said that the U.S. is an indispensable power. Well, It was de Gaulle, I think, who quipped that the cemeteries of France were filled with indispensable people. We may be a pivotal power. My friend Bill Burns describes us that way. We occupy certain spaces and circumstances in which we actually can play a determinative role, but we can't be everywhere and do everything. So you got to divide American interests, because that's what foreign policy is. It's the advancing of American interests. I divide into two categories: the must-haves that pertain to our vital interest, and the it would be nice to haves. The ones that are important, but they are in many respects discretionary, because we may not be able to do much about them. So let's talk Russia and Ukraine. You've been very tough on the administration's Ukraine policy. What is, in your view, the must-haves for the United States in Ukraine?
So I think that Ukraine uh, is a vital interest in the sense of making Russia pay a very, very heavy price for its invasion. And I think that is necessary both to discourage Russian adventurism elsewhere in Europe, whether it's Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, whatever. And also, I think that, maybe the worst thing that could happen over the next 15 years in international relations would be a war in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea with China.
Right.
I think Xi Jinping doesn't know whether he's going to attack Taiwan, but I think the more that Russia pays a price now in Ukraine, the less likely Xi Jinping is going to make such a strike. And, now, is this possible for the U.S. to really uh, screw Russia in Ukraine? I think that, earlier this year, it might have said there's, not so much we can credibly do. But I think that since August, when Ukraine really on its own began to target Russian refinery capacity, that proved incredibly successful. And their ability to take out Russian refineries and oil capacity, I think, has really undermined the Russian economy. They have these new Flamingo missiles that are coming online, and we don't know how much to believe Ukraine in terms of the capacity of the Flamingos, but they've already managed to take something like 1/5 of Russian refinery capacity out. I think that is likely to continue. It makes me think that we should have been more willing to let Ukraine strike Russian economic targets. I think we should be giving Ukraine intelligence about targeting. Um, and I think that Ukraine now can put enough pressure with American help on the Russian economy that Putin may be willing to sue for peace.
Right. We have the capacity to provide the Ukrainians with long-range strike capacity, which would enable them not just to strike refinery targets, but key Russian infrastructure, including Moscow. So the argument is, well, look, hey, they're striking Kyiv in a merciless, ruthless manner. Why shouldn't the United States provide Ukraine with unlimited capacity to do to Moscow what Moscow is doing to Kyiv? Now, I have an answer to that question, but I pose it because it comes back down to the question of whether or not Ukraine is a vital American national interest. And when I say vital, I mean vital to our security, vital to our prosperity, and an issue on which a president would be willing to put Americans in harm's way. So can you have it both ways, Nick Kristof? Can you say we need a tougher policy, but still hold back with some restraint and constraint to avoid the Russians escalating in ways that might
Yeah.
truly?
Yeah, I think we have to calibrate. I mean, I'm I'm a big believer in kind of ad hoc decision making. I mean,
Right.
George H.W. Bush is, I mean, that was kind of his model, and I think there's something to be said for actually weighing things and being a relentless empiricist. And in the case of Ukraine, look, I don't have the best intelligence on that, obviously, but there are smart people who do have that intelligence who think that if we did help the Ukraine, if we supplied the weapons that hit Moscow, then that Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon, and that the risk of escalation would be considerable.
Right.
Um, I tended to think that Biden maybe overstated that risk, but I'm not sure. And that would be such a disaster for the world that I think I'm more inclined to help Ukraine with targeting information, with helping them build the flamingos, with things like that, than with actually giving them tomahawks with which they hit the Kremlin.
Got it. Okay, China. You quote Win Lord, who said that the notion of a China expert is an oxymoron. You wrote a very tough piece on Trump's latest success, as the administration portrays it, in the sort of tariff truce with the Chinese. Are we getting China wrong, Nick?
Well, we as a lot of people, but I do think that President Trump got China wrong and that he started a trade war thinking that because China exports more to the US than we do to them, that we had the leverage. I don't think he appreciated the fact that China's control over rare earths gives it a huge strategic lever that led China to weaponize the rare earths. And, that that is enormous leverage. Our economy, our industry is so dependent on rare earths and rare earth magnets that the upshot was that Trump subsequently began to frantically pull back. And today, the tariff level that China faces is, barely above Europe, similar to that of Southeast Asia. And meanwhile, China has this sort of Damocles of the ability to control rare earths hanging over us. And I think that every time President Trump thinks about a arms sale to Taiwan or letting the Taiwan president travel through the U.S. or escorts through the South China Sea, or NVIDIA chips to Beijing. All these issues, China now has leverage over us that will continue for years and years to come. So I
Yeah,
think we're in a worse place now than we were a year ago.
I think that's right. Finally, on Gaza, you've taken a good many hits for your views on Gaza, and you did write a column, I think, in late August, which I would urge everyone to read, on how you answered your critics. I don't want to get into the TikTok on this issue, but I will ask you one question because it's a question I ask myself all the time. Even if you got Gaza right, better governance, more security, truly ending the war, and maybe even trying to build a bridge to reconstruct. Where, by the way, tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin. I tend to believe, even though counterfactuals are hard, that had Rabin lived, and I'll betray a political bias here, had George H.W. Bush and James Baker, my boss, got another 4 years. Had Rabin lived with Baker and Bush, you might actually have gotten an agreement either between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and Syria, but that's truly back in the day. Ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems to me to be a unbelievably galactically complicated and tall lift. And if you can't offer a political horizon and some hope to Israelis and Palestinians, then it's hard to see how you turn the horrors of October 7 into something that could be of real benefit to both peoples.
So, I think that's largely right. I have a really hard time seeing how a two-state solution comes to pass. But I would also, and it seems funny to be telling a peace negotiator this, but I'm a believer in, incremental gains and that
Hey,
fixing things isn't always about solving problems. It's sometimes about leaving people a little better off. And I
Yep.
think that, we are better off now with a ceasefire, even if people are still being killed in Gaza than we were a month ago. In the West Bank, I think we have to work a lot harder to try to prevent these out of control settlers from terrorizing Palestinian populations. I would like you know, I believe in pushing Israel a lot harder in the West Bank just to improve the well-being. I would make the argument that if you let settlers vote, and if you Palestinians are not on a path toward a independent state, then they should give Palestinians the vote there. And they're not going to, but it's at least a way of underscoring the inequality
Mm.
in the Palestinian territories. And miraculously, things can change. I mean, we saw that in East Timor, we saw that in Northern Ireland, we've seen that in various places.
In
But
South Africa, Nick, where no one, I put myself at the top of the list, ever believed. Well, you needed a
yeah,
Mandela and a de Klerk, but no, we can't see what's in front of us for good or ill. I can't imagine saying never to my kids or my grandkids, let alone never to Israelis and Palestinians uh, for generations to come. It's irresponsible to say never. And I agree.
yeah.
Sometimes small steps in pursuit of a broader goal. Last question, even though we're over time. What gives you hope, Nick Kristof?
So, Aaron, people are always, they think because I'm covering war and genocide and poverty that it must be the most dour, grim, pessimistic person around. It's actually kind of opposite for a couple of reasons. One is that over the course of my career, I've seen incredible progress in the human condition. When the number of children dying before the age of 5 is halved. When we were kids, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate. Now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. And then the other thing is that when you're out in the field covering these things, you really see that side by side with the worst of humanity, you find the very best.
Yeah.
And that people are just capable of incredible courage. And one of the people that left the deepest impression on me was this Pakistani woman I came to know in the Punjab, Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by a village council to be gang raped because of the something her brother supposedly had done. And then the village council, they gang raped her. And their expectation was that Mukhtar would then kill herself out of shame. And instead, she prosecuted her attackers. She sent them to prison. She used compensation money for their rape to start the first school in her village because she believed that that was the best way to chip away at the misogyny and cruelty she had suffered. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school.
Wow.
And you just, you're in that village and you see the children of her attackers, and you just understand that when tested, we humans are capable of incredible magnanimity and strength and resilience and courage. That gives me hope.
That's wonderful, Nick. I'll count you in the the category of the way Jack Kennedy used to describe himself as an idealist without illusion. That's where I am. I think maybe that's where you are.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I want to thank you so much for sharing 45 plus minutes with us. It's what you do is phenomenal. Keep on doing it. And
Right back at you.
all right. Take care, Nick Kristof.
Be well.
Bye bye.